Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am Sean and this is part 3 of me recommending books on the top 1000 list, 1000 Books to Read Before You Die by James Mustich. So let's get into it. So first, how the ranking system works. S tier is a flawless masterpiece. Everyone in the world should read it. A tier is a really good book, but not the best book in the world. B tier is a pretty good book, but it's something I might forget to recommend, but it's still definitely worth reading. Of these, S, A, and B tier all count as recommended reads by me. Now, something I want to be very clear about, I would really recommend that everyone read every book because you never know what you might enjoy. But of the books that I would personally say, hey, you should read this book, it would be S, A, and B tier. C tier is a book that is just okay, and that's really it. It's not good, it's not great, it's not bad, it's not terrible, it's just okay. D tier, even though it sounds bad, D tier is a book that I just could not get into. I do not know if it's really even a bad book, I cannot say. Just for one reason or another, I could not get into it. It was not for me. And finally, E tier is a book that I hated and likely rage quit. First, we have Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This book unfortunately gets D tier because I do not like poetry and I do not like memoirs. And this book was a memoirs by a poet. So I tried to read it, just not for me. Next is Russell Banks' The Sweet Hereafter. I got this book along with another book signed by Russell Banks just because he's on the top 1000 list, and I loved this book, so it gets S tier. It's one of the more beautifully written books I've ever read. Just everything about the book was flawless. I loved every part of it. Next is Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot. This is a book that I'd heard of, but I didn't know anything about it. So when I picked it up, I was surprised and a little bit disappointed to see that it is a play, because I'm not too much into plays. Well, I hated this book, so it falls into E tier. The thing is, reading this play, I just thought it was meaningless garbage, and what was kind of funny is it read a lot like a play I wrote in college where I didn't do the homework for the previous night. So before class, in about 5 or 10 minutes, I just quickly wrote this play that was like 5 pages long, and it was just terrible. It was meaningless and whatever. I just wrote it up real quick to get the credit. And the thing I wrote felt very similar to this play by Samuel Beckett. It was just meaningless. It was garbage. It was the writing equivalent of doodling. Like, why anyone would take this seriously, I don't know. It seems like it was just something the writer wrote just as an exercise, and why they published it, why anyone performed it, why anyone liked it, I cannot say. I think it's garbage, so it gets E tier. Next on the list is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Now, I have a signed book by Burgess, so I was pretty excited to give this book a shot because I just knew of the title A Clockwork Orange, but I didn't know anything about it, I thought. It turns out I did know of the book, I just didn't know the things that I knew of were from this book, if that makes sense. Like the famous scene where the guy is made to watch violent films that has been lampooned in The Simpsons. So when it got to that scene, I was like, oh, that's where this came from. It came from this book. I was really divided on this book for a long while. When I started it, I was so close to rage quitting this book because it's written in like a made-up language. And I just hated it. I thought it was stupid. Why would anyone write this? Why would anyone publish this? I hated it. But since I have the signed book by him, I kind of really wanted to give it every chance in the world. And it took me a long time to get into the book, like 70%. I was still not liking it. But by about 70% mark, I was starting to learn the language so I could understand it. And it was just really interesting reading this book in this other language. And so at that point, that really changed the experience of reading it. So it's not the best book in the world. It's not my favorite, but it was definitely an experience reading it. And I am glad that I read it all the way through. So A Clockwork Orange gets A tier. Not so much because it is my favorite book in the world or the best book in the world, but because it is an experience reading it. Next on the list is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is a book I did not know anything about before reading it, but after about 15, 20, 25 pages or so, I rage quit this book. And the reason was repetition of the word little. And I read it off in one of my book reviews. I'll try to find it and post it in the link up here so you could see where I read all the uses of little in the first 20 pages or so, and it is just terrible. So I hated The Secret Garden. It gets E tier, no doubt. Hated that book. Next on the list is The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This book is pretty difficult to rank because from a pure historical perspective, the book is great in a way. It's a treasure of like Middle English. However, if you are not into Middle English, the book is really hard to read and get into, and the modern translation just does not do it justice, while the old or the Middle English original is just so difficult to read. So I think this book is more better like if you were actually studying Middle English, then it would be like an S tier book. It's flawless. It's the standard of Middle English. I think you'd have to read it. But if you're like not taking a college course on it, I don't really see too much reason to read it. I would definitely say you should read just a few lines at least, just for the experience because it's so unique. But would I really recommend it to people? No. But in spite of that, I'm going to give it B tier. Again, just along the lines of you should read at least a few lines just for the experience. So to be clear, I'm not saying you should try to force yourself to read the whole book. I'm not going to recommend that. What I do recommend, pick it up at the library, browse through it, read a chapter or so, read 10 pages, and yeah. Next is The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. I really wanted to like this book. I have not seen any of the movies, I think, but I just kind of knew of that title, Last of the Mohicans, and I wanted to like it, but it was just impossible to get into and like. So I do not know if there is a good story here at all, but in Cooper's hands, it was just unreadable, and that's really unfortunate because the book, the story, may be great. I do not know. But the writing was just so dull and wordy and boring, and Cooper writes in like Old English, so everyone is like ye and thou and yonder and all this stuff. And it's just so unreadable. So I don't know. I have to give the book C tier. I can't recommend it. I tried my best. I just could not get into it, really. Next is Roald Dahl, Matilda. This was my first read by him. I'd seen the movie years and years ago, and I didn't remember it all too much. The thing with Matilda is I think it does everything it's supposed to do. It's pretty much just a good children's story. It's not like compared to other books, like a standout book, but it is a children's story. So you have to rank it or view it in terms of that. And I think it does everything it should. So for the ranking, I would give it B tier overall. If I was ranking it like in terms of like just children's stories, like if this was a children's stories ranking video, it would be S or A tier for sure. But compared to everything, I'm just going to give it B tier, so you should give it a shot for sure. But it just doesn't quite stand up to some of the other books on this list. Next is The Man in the High Castle by Philip Dick. This was the first book I read by him, and I'm going to, again, try to post a link to my review somewhere up there. I just did not like this book. I'd seen the promotional materials for, is it an Amazon show? And the Amazon show looked cool, and I love the premise. The Nazis and Japanese win World War II. That's great. But the whole book, it was just boring. There was nothing about it I liked at all. Just like with The Last of the Mohicans, how it should have been written by a different author. Same thing with this book, because Philip Dick just went in the complete wrong direction. I did not like any part of it. So no, I can plainly say I did not like this book at all. But did I really viscerally hate it? I would say no, so I'm going to give The Man in the High Castle C tier. Next are a couple books by William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying and Light in August. I have read a few books, or tried to read a few books by William Faulkner now, and he is definitely one of my least favorite authors. I just cannot get into his writing style. As I Lay Dying gets D tier. I just could not get into that book whatsoever. I probably lasted like 5, 10, 15 pages and nope. Light in August, I just actually started and quit that last night. And the thing was, at first the writing was okay. I thought I may have enjoyed it. But then I noticed he was repeating the word reckon. In the first 19 pages, he used reckon 20 times. And that's not an exaggeration. I counted them out. There were at least 20 uses in the first 19 pages. I reckon that whatever. That's just so annoying, and he does it throughout the book. So big red flag there. The second big red flag is he uses the N word throughout the book. So combine it with not liking William Faulkner's writing, repetition of reckon, and the N word. Nope, I am not reading that book. Screw that. So that book, Light in August, gets E tier. Hate William Faulkner. Next is Faust by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This again is a play, and that's a big red flag for me. I'm not into plays. I tried reading this, but after reading like 3 or 4 pages, I did not really understand or comprehend or follow a single word of it, really. I did not know anything what was going on. It was just going in one ear and out the other. So I just knew this wasn't going to happen for me. And it's a pretty long play, too. So it gets D tier. Next is The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. This was actually like the 4th Graham Greene book I read, and it's the first on the top 1000 list. And Graham Greene is a real unique writer for me because for the most part I cannot really say I really am enjoying his books, even all the way up until the end. But when I finish his books, and I've finished every one of them that I've read, which is quite an accomplishment for me since I DNF so many books, I still kind of enjoy, or I'm glad that I read his books. So I cannot say what I like about him, but I like all of his books all the same. He's a very peculiar writer to me because he's definitely not like one of my favorite writers. He doesn't blow you away with his writing or his stories or his plots or characters or anything, but I still kind of like them. So I'm going to give it B tier. It's, again, not one of the best books in the world. If you're going into it expecting it to be one of your favorites, you will probably be disappointed. But every Graham Greene book that I've read, I have enjoyed, or I'm glad I read it. So I give it B tier. Next is The Firm by John Grisham. And I could go a lot of ways with this book. Oh, and I have a signed book by John Grisham, which is really neat. I am not into courtroom dramas or whatever, so I was really leery about ever reading a John Grisham book. I kind of wanted to at some point. But anyway, it's on the top 1000 list, and the book, it read very much like the work of a young writer, so from that perspective, I can sympathize with it. A lot of early books by writers are pretty crappy, but I looked up the summaries for some of John Grisham's other books, his more modern books, and they read very similar to this one. So I think instead of being like the work of a young writer, I think this was the style John Grisham adopted for the rest of his career. So I just didn't really like it. It was actually like laughably bad in some places. Just, it read like a low-budget James Bond movie or something, and I just didn't really like it. I thought he went in the wrong direction. I kind of like his writing style a bit, his pacing, the way he writes characters, but in terms of plotting, it was a major disappointment. It was like laughably bad. I'm gonna give the book C tier. There's a lot of ways I could go with it, but at the end of the day, the book is just overall okay. But still, I had problems with the book, so I mean like laughably bad, so I would really not recommend it. Next is Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This is a book I'd never heard of before, so I didn't expect much of anything. The writing was kind of just okay, but the book never did anything for me. So I really do not know what to say about it too much. It just didn't work for me, so it gets D tier. I don't know. It could be a good book. It may not be, but it just wasn't for me. I couldn't get into it, so D tier. Next is another book I recently DNF'd, and that is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I have 2 signed books by Heller, which I was really excited about because I knew Catch-22 is such a classic book. Like, even if you've never heard of the book Catch-22, even if you didn't know it was based on a book, you've probably heard that expression Catch-22. It's just so much in our vocabulary today. So I was pretty enthusiastic about giving it a shot. I knew it was like satire of World War II. When I began the book, I was thinking I would be pleasantly surprised. The book, like I said, is satire, and it felt pretty similar to like The Princess Bride by William Goldman, a book that I loved. So for a little while, I thought this book, Catch-22, would be a potential like S-tier book. But the thing was, after that, after like the first 10 pages or so, I noticed it just kept repeating the same kind of jokes, and the dialogue was just really annoying. The book just really wore down. The humor just did not sustain itself. Basically, the longer the book went, the less I liked it, the less I laughed, the more I groaned, the more I did eye rolls and everything. So I read 100 pages trying to give the book every chance in the world, but it just kept getting worse. I just kept hating it more and more. So in the end, I just DNF'd after 100 pages. So ranking it is difficult. I could really give it C, D, or E tier, but I'm going to give it D tier. And like I say, the thing is, the very start of it had some potential, but the whole rest of the book, it just did not sustain it. It was just annoying, and frankly, I just hated it more and more. So I give it D tier. If I tried reading any more of it, it would probably be E tier. So D tier. Really unfortunate because it's such a classic, and I'm excited I have 2 signed books by him, but I just hated that book. Next is Kazuo Ishiguro, The Remains of the Day. I had heard of this author for a while, and I didn't really know, I think, that this was a top 1000 book when I picked it up from the library, because I wanted to read a Kazuo Ishiguro book, just because I've always heard of him. So the thing is, the story wasn't exactly my favorite, but I definitely respected his writing ability. Really, he did everything I think he could have quite flawlessly, like his storytelling, his plot, his characters, his characterization, his themes. It was all just really well done. So I think Kazuo Ishiguro is definitely a skilled, talented writer. So I'm going to give the book B tier. It's not one of my favorite books in the world for sure, but I really respect Kazuo Ishiguro's writing ability, his talent, his storytelling, and all that. Quite flawless. So he is a good writer, and for that reason I would recommend the book, I guess. And I am still interested in reading other books by him. So just purely from a writing standpoint, I respect him. I think he's a good writer. Next are a couple books by Stephen King. There's 11/22/63 and Carrie. So I don't really want to go into it too deeply, but suffice it to say, I do not really like Stephen King. I have issues with him, and I'm really undecided about what to say about his books, really. I cannot decide if he's like a good writer but a poor storyteller, or a good storyteller but a poor writer. I don't know. I just have problems with Stephen King. The simplest way to explain it probably is he has too many pages. He just is too long. If he wrote like 300-page books, I may like it, but instead he writes like 1,000-page books. And he's just not good enough to be worth it. Both of these books, I'm going to give E tier. I just do not like Stephen King at all, really. Carrie is kind of the last book I'll ever plan to read by him because it's on the top 1000 list. It was the last one on the top 1000 list that I had to read. I've also read most of it, and I don't know the title, but it's like the first book in the Dark Tower series, as well as the second book, because I knew that's kind of Stephen King's magnum opus is the Dark Tower series. So I tried both of those first two books, and 11/22/63 and Carrie. But after that, I'm just not reading any more Stephen King. I just do not like him as a person. And as a writer, I think he's grossly overrated. So yeah, basically I am done with Stephen King, and I'm glad to be done with him. Next is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, which I have a signed copy of. This is signed, which is sweet because I'd heard of this book forever. I started this book, and I knew before I started it that this book does not use quotation marks, because I was talking about another book that doesn't use quotation marks on my BookTube channel, and someone mentioned, oh, Angela's Ashes, which you mentioned, doesn't have quotation marks either. So I was just like, why? I think every book needs to have quotation marks for dialogue. I don't care who you are, you have to use quotation marks. I will die on this hill. Use quotation marks, whoever you are. If you don't, I'm not reading it. So I opened this book and I started to read it, and I read probably 2 pages. I don't even know if I got to any point yet where there was dialogue, so I don't even know if I got that far. But after reading like 2 pages, I kind of just skimmed and saw again that there's no quotation marks. And I just have to hold to my guns here. I just will not read a book without quotation marks. You have to have quotation marks. I know this may seem like a silly thing to fight for, but it's just so distracting. And so why would you not use quotation marks? They are so easy to put in. Just put them in. People expect to have quotation marks. And yeah, I don't have too much advice where I say you have to write this way or I'm not reading. This is one of them. So use quotation marks. Everyone in the world. I don't care who you are. If you don't, you're trash. I'm not going to read it. It's cool, it's signed though. Next is The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. If you've seen my recent 10 More Favorite Books video, you'll recognize this book because it is on there. It definitely was not my favorite as I was reading it. I wasn't enjoying it all that much. I kept hoping something would happen to make me like the book, and it never really happened. The book was what it was. And it's so hard for me to explain, but in the end, even though the book didn't give me what I wanted, I still think there was something good about this book, and I cannot say what, but I don't know. There's just something about this book that perplexes me so much, but I still enjoy it in a way, and I would still recommend it. I'm still glad I read it, and I still want to read more by Carson McCullers. So it's a very curious thing for me because I've never quite read a book like that where the book just never really quite does anything for me. It's definitely not great. I'm never in love with it. I never really even like it, but for some reason I still enjoy it. And it's just such a weird experience. So I don't know, there's something about Carson McCullers' writing, her storytelling, her characters, her characterization in this book that, I don't know, I just like it for some reason, even though I didn't really like the book. So, this book is actually going to get A tier. It's not the best book in the world, but it's still something I would strongly recommend everyone try. I'm not going to like stake my reputation on it and say, you know, it's going to be great, you're going to love it. I don't know, you may hate it. I may have hated it, but I'd still recommend people read it because I just cannot quite figure the book out, but still I think it should be read. So I give it A tier. Next is actually going to be a re-ranking. In one of my previous ranking videos, I listed The Sea by Iris Murdoch as S tier. At the time, I had only read about 50 pages of it, and I loved it. The beginning of that book was just masterful. Well, I picked up the book again to finish it, and the thing was, I just could not really get into the book. The book was boring. Basically, the first 50 pages are great, but after that, the book just goes in a direction I just did not like whatsoever. And so I gave it about another 100 pages after that. So I read about 150 pages of this book, trying to get into it, trying to give it every chance in the world. And it just didn't work for me at all. If I was ranking just the first 50 pages, I would give it an S tier. If I was ranking like page 50 onward, it would get a D tier. So now that I've read 150 pages of it, I am going to re-rank it and give it C tier. So unfortunately, it falls out of recommended read territory, which is unfortunate because, again, the beginning of that book was just so masterful, but from that point on, just nothing about the book worked for me at all. So really unfortunate, because after reading the first 50 pages of this book, I got a signed book by Iris Murdoch, which I was really excited about since I loved the beginning so much of The Sea. But the rest of the book was just such a disappointment. So the book unfortunately gets C tier. Next is Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. So, if you've seen my channel before, you'll know I have 3 signed books by Salman Rushdie. And I got them because I knew he had the hit order put out on him. And if you don't know, it's because well, you probably know at this point, because he wrote this book, The Satanic Verses, which was deemed insulting to Islam. Iran put out a hit order on Salman Rushdie, which has been in place for like 30 years. So I really respected Salman Rushdie for that reason, because he wrote this thing that was so offensive and got a whole religion pissed off at him. I sympathize with that. Some of my books are very much the same way. So as a person, I like Salman Rushdie pretty well, and I wanted to have every book I could get by him signed. So this is where I'm gonna look like a jerkwad. So I started this book about 2 days, literally, before the stabbing, and I have had Salman Rushdie's books on my shelf for about 2 years, and I've wanted to read him all that time. And this book was on my 22 books to read in 2022 list, so I had to read it sometime this year. So I finally started reading it, and 2 days later, Salman Rushdie is stabbed. Well, at first, when I started the book, I read the first 4 pages, and I was kind of like, I'm not really into it too much, and then he was stabbed. So about a week later, this is about a week later, I tried to get into it again. Well, I read 2 more pages and just nothing was working out for me at all. I am just not getting into this book. So I read and DNF'd this book after just 6 pages, just because I could tell the writing is doing nothing for me. And I skimmed ahead just to look at the writing throughout the book. And again, it's just something I cannot get into. Part of it is he uses parentheses a lot, just randomly puts parentheses in narration or in dialogue or whatever. He uses parentheses a lot, and I don't get why. It's just so distracting, and the whole book just seems really incomprehensible to me. I just cannot even begin to see anything good about it. Just his whole writing style is unenjoyable to me, and just the characters, nothing about this book works for me at all. So after 6 pages, I chose to DNF it. So unfortunately, Midnight's Children is going to get a D tier ranking. I probably look like such an ass just a week after the stabbing, giving his book a D tier ranking, and I'm probably going to just give it 1-star rating on Goodreads. I'm sorry, I love Salman Rushdie as a person and standing up and free speech and all that, but the book itself, I cannot get into it. I hate it. I think it sucks. So, I'm sorry. Next is White Teeth by Zadie Smith. So this is a book I'd never heard of before, but after picking it up off the top 1000 list, I realized this book was pretty popular, and it's a pretty recent book too. And the thing is, I enjoyed the writing style. I think there was definitely talent there, so I had respect for that. But when I got to like 100 pages in or 150 pages in or so, even though I was enjoying the book pretty well, I kind of realized at that point that I just didn't really care. I didn't care about the characters. I didn't care about whatever the book was leading towards. Just, it didn't work for me. So the writing itself was good, but the story itself, I just wasn't invested in it. So it's real difficult to rank. I would give it B tier. So I think there's definitely writing talent here and it's kind of enjoyable, but I just couldn't get invested in the book. So that keeps it from being ranked higher. So it gets B tier. Next is Humphrey Clinker by Tobias Smollett. This is a book I'd never heard of before. And when I started it, I was kind of thinking, it's enjoyable-ish. In fact, there were parts where I was kind of thinking, hey, this could be pretty good. It's written kind of similar-ish to Jane Austen's writing. Like, not in terms of like the romance or the plots really, but just in terms of writing. It feels very similar to Jane Austen, who I hate. But there were parts of it that just felt enjoyable, like funny or whatever. So I thought the book had potential, but the problem was it's written like it's a Jane Austen book. And it's just so unreadably boring because that's the way Jane Austen is. So in the end, I just could not really get into the book just because the writing was so thick and unenjoyable. So the book, I am going to give it C tier actually, even though I couldn't really get into it. I think there was definitely potential for it, but again, I just couldn't get into it really. Still potential, so C tier. Next is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. So this is a book I was probably supposed to read in high school but didn't. The book I actually read in high school was Of Mice and Men. That was one of the first non-Clive Cussler books I ever read was Of Mice and Men. The other would have been The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. Those were kind of the first two non-Clive Cussler books that I read. So I liked Of Mice and Men pretty well. So I kind of had a overall positive impression of John Steinbeck, but I just knew of The Grapes of Wrath for years, and I just kind of knew inherently that I would not like this book. But I didn't know for sure until I actually started reading it. So I started the book a couple weeks ago, actually. I read the first sentence, and I was like, uh-oh. And the reason is because the book has a lot of description, and I do not much like description in novels because I think they're basically useless. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of effort. It's describing all these random things about nothing and describing things that have nothing to do with the plot or the characters. It's just like describing like the sun's speckled down rays of golden sunlight, and it's just like, why does that matter? Why does it matter if it's sunny or if it's rainy or if it's windy or whatever? And like red crusted earth and just all this stuff. And it's like, why does it matter if the earth is red? Why can't it be green? Why can't it be brown? I just don't like description in novels. And this book is just full of description. So I can get that people like description in novels or that they think description is good. So they read this and think, oh man, it's such vivid description. But I read it and I think, okay, there's this whole chapter and absolutely nothing happens but maybe like one sentence that you could keep. Everything else is purple prose. It could be cut and the book would read just fine without it. But he has it in for some reason. So I think description in a lot of ways is like writers trying to show off, like, aha, look at my vocabulary. But why is that description actually there? What does it further in terms of story or plot or character or whatever? It doesn't further anything. It's just useless detail. And that's what this book is. It's just useless detail. It wouldn't be so bad maybe if it was like a novella, but it's a pretty long book. So I don't really want to read this really long book of nothing but useless description when the substance of this book might be pretty good, but it would be good in a novella form. So if this book was like cut down to 125 pages, it could be great. It could be flawless. It could be the masterpiece classic American literature everyone says it is. But at like 400 pages, it's just so full of word garbage. It's word vomit. It's unnecessary words. So I hated the book. I would be really tempted to give this book E tier, but the thing is, E tier is more a book that I like have good reason to hate, and the only reason I hate this book is because of the description. There's nothing really inherently about the book where it's like I read a sentence and it's like, oh god, that's terrible. It's just I don't like description. Because of that, it's just not for me. So this book unfortunately gets a D tier ranking after the first 18 pages or so. I know it's a classic American novel and it's well loved for so many years or whatever. I just don't like the book. I don't like the description. I can't get into it. I think it's garbage. If it was a 125 page book, I would read it and might give it 5 stars. As a 400 page book, screw that. I'm not wasting my time. I don't care if it's a classic American novel. It's just full of useless description. And that's all the book is useless description. So I have achieved my rant. Rant over. It gets D tier. Just not for me. I'm sorry, John Steinbeck. I still love Of Mice and Men. And you know why Of Mice and Men is good? Because it is a novella. It's not a 400 or 500 page book dragging you through all these words. It's just like 200 pages. Bam, done. Great. Good. John Steinbeck should have written more like that. Another thing. I'm not going to go into it. So anyway. D tier. Next are a couple books by R.L. Stevenson. I really had low expectations for these, and they were Treasure Island and Kidnapped. Now, first with Treasure Island. I actually liked it pretty well. If I was just judging, like, if the book was just totally obscure and I was just reading this random book, I might give it B tier. Like, it was just okay, especially for an older book, like written 125, 150 years ago or so. The book definitely has some age on it, but it's still pretty readable. So I would give it like B tier just on its own merits. But here's the thing, Treasure Island, it's such a legacy book because basically this book almost created the pirate adventure genre. So everything you know about pirates probably comes from this book. Like pirates with peg legs, and they have talking parrots, and they have shiver me timbers, and there's maps to buried treasure and pieces of 8 and Black Spot and all this stuff. It all comes from this book. So instead of watching or reading all these other pirate stories or pirate shows or whatever, I think you should go back and read the original. And the original is Treasure Island by R.L. Stevenson. So for that reason, I am going to give Treasure Island A tier. I think everyone should probably read it just because it is where all this pirate stuff really comes from. I don't know if that's exactly true. There may, of course, be other books that R.L. Stevenson kind of drew inspiration from. But I think for most pirate stories and stuff, we really get it from Treasure Island. So I think it's definitely worth reading instead of watching the stuff that rips off what R.L. Stevenson did. Read R.L. Stevenson. So read Treasure Island. So it gets A tier. Kidnapped was definitely not as enjoyable. It's written like in more of an older style. So even though it was written, I think actually after Treasure Island, it reads like it was written like in the early 1800s or the 1700s or even the 1600s maybe. It feels like definitely an older book, like the dialogue and all that. It's written more phonetically, so it's a lot harder to read. And ultimately, it's just not as enjoyable to read. There was a scene in the book where there's basically this attack on this ship and they're inside this room and they're trying to fend off all these people invading the room. That was a great scene. If the book would have been more like that, it would have gotten a more positive ranking. But as a whole, the book was just pretty boring, unenjoyable, dry, especially because of the way it is written. So Kidnapped is just going to get a C tier ranking. Next is Gulliver's Travels. This is another book I reviewed recently on my channel, so if you want to go search for that, go ahead. Gulliver's Travels. I really kind of had low expectations for it because I knew the most famous scene from that book, which is where the guy wakes up and he's in the land of little people. So I was kind of like, well, I kind of know what the book is about. I know that scene. What I like though is that scene literally occurs on like page 2 or 3. So from that point on, everything in the book that happens is new to me. So I really kind of enjoyed that. So there are things in that book that are pretty hilarious, like laugh out loud funny. And I think to write something that is funny then and funny 300 years later or whatever, that is such an accomplishment. Like, how do you make someone in 300 years laugh at a joke? You know it has to be funny then. So I really enjoyed Gulliver's Travels. There are definitely parts which are pretty boring or slow, where you can definitely tell the book is a few hundred years old. But in spite of that, there is still enough in there that I really liked and that I thought was really funny. So Gulliver's Travels gets A tier. I think everyone should read it. Again, you should not really expect the world from it because it is an older book, so there is some difficult parts, you know, boring parts, whatever. But I think you should give the book a try and be patient with it because some of the funniest scenes are like towards the end as well. So I think you have to be patient with the book, and yeah. So A tier for Gulliver's Travels. Next is Sophocles, the Oedipus trilogy. Or is it Oedipus? Oedipus? I don't know. Here's the thing, actually, about this book. The book I read was actually the complete plays of Sophocles. So he has like 7 or 8 existing plays. He probably wrote like 100 or so, but of them we only have about 7 left in existence. So the Oedipus trilogy is 3 of those plays. I'm going to kind of make an exception here. Instead of just reviewing the Oedipus trilogy, I'm going to kind of talk about the complete plays of Sophocles. And here's the thing. I have read quite a bit of Greek plays now. So I've read like Aristophanes and Aeschylus, and I'm reading Homer right now, the Iliad. And so I've read quite a bit of Greek drama, Greek plays, whatever, Greek tragedy and all this stuff. And of them, I really liked the plays of Sophocles the most. They're the most enjoyable, I think. I don't know if it is his exact writing style or the subject of his plays, or if it's just I'm more familiar with like Greek theater now that I recognize these characters more. But for whatever reason, of all the Greek plays I've read really, I really liked Sophocles. I am enjoying Homer, the Iliad quite a bit as well, so I am definitely going to recommend that as well. But I really like Sophocles. I am going to give Sophocles both the Oedipus trilogy and all his plays really, because there's only 7 of them, so you may as well read them all. I'm going to give it A tier. I think everyone should read it, I guess. So yeah, it's definitely worth reading. Next is Tom Wolfe, The Bonfire of the Vanities. So I did not really know much at all what to expect from this book. I have heard of the title before, but I didn't know what to expect. And the thing is, as I started reading it, I just really knew early on this book was not working for me. And the more I read, the more I hated it. By about page 20, I was ready to give up in rage. So I am going to give The Bonfire of the Vanities E tier. Last is Germinal by Emile Zola. So I'd never heard of this book before. And so when I started reading it, it was kind of funny. There was this line in the book. The book is set in Germany, I think. There is a line about like economic hardships or whatever from the war or the ongoing war. So, set in Germany, I was like, okay, which war? World War I? World War II? So I looked it up just because I was curious, because it kept kind of mentioning this war, and the book was written in like the 1800s, sometime like 1880s or something. So obviously it wasn't World War One or World War Two. So Emile Zola, you have a war coming to Germany if you didn't know. A couple wars. So hang on, buddy. Anyway, here's the thing about this book. I think the writing is pretty decent or even good, so I can't really say anything bad about that. And especially for its age, it's pretty readable. So that's all pretty positive. The thing is, I just am not really too much into the plot or the story. The story is basically about these people who work in a mine are having these economic hardships. They have a real hard life. They are living in poverty and they're doing all this hard work and they want more rights. They want to be paid better and all this stuff. So it's kind of a story about, you know, workers' rights and getting just pay and all that. So I think that is all really well and good, especially for its time. Like, it's a real timely story. It's an important message at the time, especially. So that is all well and good. I respect that. But the book is pretty long, like 400 or 500 pages, and it's pretty small print. And what's actually kind of funny is this is actually like book 17 in a series, but for some reason the top 1000 list just says start out with this one. So I think it's fine, actually. It's not like written where I'm lost. So I think you can start this book on its own and read it just fine. But yeah, it's like book 17 in a series, which by itself, that's impressive. So like a 17 book series or something, that's definitely a major life's work. So I respect that too. But here's kind of the thing. I just don't really want to read this 500 page book. I'm just not really too excited about that. So although the writing is decent and fine and the story is fine and I appreciate all that and the messages, I understand that, that's all fine, that's all well and good. I don't really want to read the book, even though it may be a pretty decent book and may be historically significant and all that, whatever. I just don't really want to read it. And here's another thing that's pretty funny to me. This may get me in a little bit of trouble, but oh well. In the book, it talks about these miners who are, you know, they're really poor. But it also says this family has 7 kids, and so they're having this difficulty feeding all these children, and especially feeding them on this salary they get from the mine or whatever. And so I read that and I just think, why do you have 7 kids if you can't afford to feed them? Why should I really feel bad for you? I mean, that's kind of your problem. If you just basically, if you can't feed the kids, why are you still having them? If you didn't have any kids or you just had 1 kid, you would be fine. But oh no, I'm gonna go have 7 kids. And then, oh no, I can't feed all these kids. I can't take care of all these kids. Someone else should pay me more and take care of me and all this stuff. And that's their fault. And no, not really. It's your fault. You had 7 kids. Why? Just control yourself. And I know people are like, oh, how can you tell people to control me? Whatever. Well, if you're gonna have 7 kids, don't whine about not having money to feed them. If you're gonna have 7 kids, you better have the means to feed them and provide for them. That's what being a responsible parent should be. If you're gonna have kids, be willing and able to support them. Don't have kids you can't afford to keep and whatever, because kids are expensive and you should know that, and you should be responsible and be responsible before you take action. And I know people, that's gonna like offend people, but that's being a responsible adult. That's being a responsible parent. Don't take up responsibilities that you can't live up to. So I just don't really feel sympathetic to them. You had 7 kids. You knew what you were doing. Yeah. You chose to have 7 kids, so you have to find a way to feed those kids. If you can't feed them, that's your own fault for having all these kids. You should have had none, or you should have had 1, or stop at 2. Don't have 7. That's your own fault. That's your problem. So, yeah. So, responsibility, self-control. Yeah. I've said more than enough, but that's basically my thoughts on the book. So that's what I think about the book. Did I even say what the ranking is for that? So I give Germinal by Emile Zola C tier. Pretty decent book, decent writing, decent message. I get that. That's all well and good, but I just didn't really want to read it. And I didn't really have sympathy for these characters having 7 kids. Anyway, that is it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Have you read any books on this list? Do you disagree wildly with any of my opinions? Do you agree with any of my opinions? What do you think? Let me know. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.